Inside the Apostolic Palace of the Vatican on the night of October 30th, 1503, something happened that shook the Christian world to its core. Beneath vaulted ceilings built to honor the divine, 50 naked courtesans crawled across a freezing marble floor. Cardinals and bishops stood rigid, their silence heavier than incense. And at the center of it all, watching, smiling, even laughing, sat Pope Alexander VI. He presided over the scene like it was a private celebration. But what the witnesses saw that night was only the opening act. The true nightmare had not yet begun. What followed would be so depraved, so violently opposed to the very idea of sanctity, that even hardened chroniclers centuries later struggled to write it down. This is the story of Lucrezia Borgia, a woman trapped in a dynasty where power mattered more than blood, faith, or human dignity. A woman whose wedding night became one of the darkest stains in Vatican history. In the autumn of 1503, the bells of St. Peter's rang across Rome with news that quickly consumed Italy. The Pope had announced that his daughter, twice widowed under circumstances dripping with suspicion, would marry once more. But this time, there would be no distant palace, no quiet, noble hall. The ceremony would take place inside the Vatican itself, in the papal apartments, beneath frescoes and symbols meant to represent heaven's judgment. The groom chosen for Lucrezia was Alfonso d'Este, young heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara. To the rest of Italy, this alliance looked like a political triumph. To Alfonso, it felt like a sentence being read aloud. Lucrezia's past was infamous. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had fled Rome claiming assassins were hunting him. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, had been strangled on Vatican steps, with rumors pointing straight toward her brother, Cesare Borgia. And now another Alfonso was being bound to the Borgia family, as if history were daring itself to repeat. Alfonso d'Este knew the danger. Every noble in Italy did. The Borgias did not marry for love, and they did not forgive refusal. So he tried everything to escape. Diplomatic excuses, delays, pleas sent through emissaries, even hints that Ferrara's health and stability required his presence. But Pope Alexander VI was not a man who tolerated a no, especially not from a family he intended to bend. Inside the Vatican, surrounded by scarlet-robed cardinals, his command was absolute. Messengers rode day and night toward Ferrara with a single brutal message: accept this marriage or be destroyed. If the Este family resisted, Ferrara would face Cesare's merciless armies. Their dynasty could be shattered overnight, and excommunication would strip them of legitimacy and allies in one stroke. Italy understood this truth well. No one survived a conflict with the Borgias unless the Borgias allowed it. Realizing resistance meant annihilation, Duke Ercole d'Este ordered his son to travel to Rome and surrender to the unavoidable alliance. Meanwhile, in her Vatican apartments, Lucrezia gazed out over the eternal city. Her face carried a weight far older than her 21 years. Europe had painted her as a seductress, a poisoner, a woman who moved men across a chessboard with a smile. But those closest to her knew a quieter, crueler truth. Lucrezia was not the mastermind of her family's schemes. She was their instrument. Her first marriage had been dissolved the moment it ceased to benefit her father and brother. Her second husband, whom she had genuinely loved, had been murdered before her eyes, a fate she could neither prevent nor avenge. Her attendants whispered that she woke in the dead of night clutching her chest, trembling from nightmares she refused to describe. She knew this third marriage would not bring love, but even she could not imagine what her wedding night was being designed to become. Something dark, calculated, and merciless was gathering behind Vatican walls. Preparations moved quickly, yet the atmosphere inside the Apostolic Palace felt suffocating. Servants averted their eyes. Cardinals muttered in low tones that died whenever footsteps approached. Strange figures slipped through forbidden hallways at odd hours. Guests arrived through side doors and hidden passages instead of the grand entrances meant for celebrations. The rumors were everywhere. Secret instructions, private lists, a kind of excitement that did not belong to a holy wedding. One man felt the weight of it more than anyone: Johann Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies. His duty was to oversee papal rituals and record important events in his diary. He had seen plenty under Alexander VI: extravagant feasts, sacred offices sold like trinkets, bribes disguised as blessings. But something about this wedding set his nerves on edge. This night, he sensed, would eclipse every scandal he had ever written down. He could feel it in the way the palace breathed, in the nervous hands of servants, in the sharp, quiet smiles exchanged behind curtains. A trap was being built, gilded and polished, and both bride and groom were already walking toward its center. In December, Alfonso d'Este entered Rome with a small escort. His journey from Ferrara had dragged him through frozen mountain passes and battered roads, while dread grew heavier in his chest with every mile. But nothing prepared him for the sight of the Vatican itself. A stone colossus rose above the city, half bathed in candlelight, half lost in scaffolding. It looked less like the heart of Christianity and more like a fortress built to swallow anyone who dared oppose it. The welcome inside was overwhelming in the way a storm is overwhelming. Pope Alexander VI sat on his throne robed in shimmering white and gold, the candlelight making him look almost molten. Beside him stood Cesare Borgia, silent, still, and terrifying in his restraint. Though only 26, Cesare was already feared across Italy. Cities surrendered at his approach. Families vanished at his command. When his eyes settled on Alfonso, there was no mistaking the message. You are not a guest here. You are property. Over the following weeks, Alfonso endured humiliation disguised as celebration. At banquets, he was seated beside courtesans while high-ranking clergy watched with thin, amused smiles. On hunts, Cesare displayed a ruthless skill that felt less like sport and more like a warning, every arrow saying the same thing: I decide who lives and who falls. During receptions, Alexander VI made pointed jokes about the tragic ends of Lucrezia's previous husbands. The words were polished, almost friendly, but the meaning underneath was sharp as glass. A Borgia son-in-law does not live long unless he's useful. Alfonso tried to preserve what remained of his dignity, but by then he was a prisoner wrapped in silk and ceremony. He slept in rooms watched day and night by papal guards. Each passing hour stripped away another illusion. He had walked into a trap. There was no road back. And while Alfonso endured this quiet siege, preparations of a very different kind were unfolding deeper within the Vatican. Cesare took personal command of the wedding night feast, and his vision pushed far beyond what even Rome's most decadent circles dared whisper aloud. Behind closed doors, father and son finalized details that would have horrified any soul who still believed the church was sacred. 50 of the most striking courtesans in Rome were hand-selected and taken into secret chambers beneath the palace. These were not ordinary prostitutes, but educated, refined women who frequented noble salons. Many trembled when they learned what was expected. None dared defy the head of Christendom. They were ordered to arrive in lavish velvet and silk garments they would later be forced to remove. They were guided through hidden passageways by lantern light so that, on the night of the wedding, they could be funneled into the papal apartments without warning. Servants who caught glimpses of these preparations crossed themselves again and again, whispering prayers like armor. Even Lucrezia sensed it. Though she was excluded from most preparations, she felt the tension thickening in the air. Her maids spoke of unfamiliar faces gliding through corridors, courtesans appearing where they did not belong, and Cesare moving about with a smile that made their blood go cold. The night before the wedding, unable to endure the suffocating atmosphere, Lucrezia fled to the Sistine Chapel. Beneath Michelangelo's vast painted sky, beneath God's hand reaching toward Adam, she collapsed to her knees. She did not pray for happiness. She prayed for rescue, for intervention, for a sign that someone, anyone, still saw her. But the chapel remained silent. The divine felt impossibly distant. Candles trembled in the winter air, seeping through ancient cracks, as if even the flames wanted to escape. Outside, the Vatican prepared for a celebration that was about to blur the line between sacred ritual and unspeakable corruption. And in his chamber, Johann Burchard reviewed the final protocol, quill shaking in his hand. He understood too well that what he was about to record might either be buried forever or stand as the most damning testimony in church history. October 30th, 1503 was coming, and with it, a spectacle that would drag even the walls of the Vatican closer to hell. October 30th dawned with the grandeur of a papal wedding. The bells of St. Peter's rolled across the 7 hills of Rome, calling crowds into the streets around the Vatican. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, desperate for a glimpse of the infamous bride. Some came out of devotion, some out of curiosity, and many out of that darker hunger Rome had always carried for scandal, wearing a holy mask. Inside the Apostolic Palace, Lucrezia was surrounded by attendants from the moment the sky began to pale. They washed her, braided her hair, laced her into layers of silk and gold, until she looked less like a woman and more like a relic prepared for display. Her gown shimmered under candlelight, embroidered with gold thread that caught every flicker like liquid flame. Pearls were woven into her long, bright hair, falling down her shoulders in careful braids. Her face was powdered pale to hide the exhaustion beneath her eyes. But powder couldn't hide the truth. There was no joy in her expression, no anticipation, only the stillness of someone walking toward something she couldn't stop. When she looked into the mirror, she didn't see a bride. She saw a sacrifice. The ceremony was held in the papal chapel, a chamber drowned in gilded walls and holy paintings. Alexander VI officiated personally. His voice boomed through the space as he bound Alfonso and Lucrezia together before God, as if heaven itself had asked for this union. Rows of scarlet-clad cardinals stood rigid along the chapel walls. Their faces were carved into practiced masks of devotion. But behind the masks flickered something harder to hide: dread. Every one of them knew the Borgia reputation, and every one of them sensed that what they were witnessing was only the prelude. When the vows ended, when the rings were placed, when the blessings were spoken, the guests were escorted to the Borgia apartments for the feast. The halls they passed through were resplendent with frescoes painted by Pinturicchio. Stories of saints and martyrs stretched across the walls, their serene faces frozen in paint. Yet even those holy eyes seemed tainted by the debauchery gathering below them, as if the palace itself could feel what was coming. Inside the apartments, enormous tables overflowed with roasted boar, pheasants still adorned in feathers, exotic fruits piled like treasure, and goblets filled with deep red wine from the richest vineyards in Italy. Cardinals sat alongside Roman nobles. Emissaries from Ferrara murmured carefully chosen compliments. Courtiers handpicked by Alexander and Cesare watched with the patience of predators who already knew how the night would end. At the head table sat Alfonso and Lucrezia, trapped in a celebration that already felt unreal. Alfonso's smile was thin enough to crack. Lucrezia's hands rested folded in her lap, fingers clenched so tightly her knuckles showed white beneath the silk. At first, the banquet unfolded like any noble feast. Lutes and viols filled the air with gentle music. Toasts rose and fell. Polite diplomacy played its part. The wine moved freely. Laughter drifted here and there, wary but present. Then, slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Alexander VI drank heavily, growing louder, more jubilant. His eyes shone with that flushed excitement that isn't joy so much as appetite. He clapped his hands at jokes that weren't funny. He leaned forward in his throne as if waiting for a curtain to rise. Cesare, who had been silent for most of the evening, finally stood. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A small tilt of his head was enough. The massive doors slammed shut. Guards stepped into place at every exit, metal and muscle forming a living wall. The message was immediate and unmistakable. No one would leave. A hush fell over the room, thick as smoke. Guests turned toward one another in confusion. A few cardinals shifted as if to rise, but the guards' hands drifted to sword hilts. Everyone froze again. Then side doors opened. 50 courtesans stepped into the hall. They were draped in velvet and jewels, hair arranged in elaborate styles, perfume heavy enough to cut through the wine. Many were famed beauties known to Rome's elite, women who had once walked salons with confidence. Now their faces were pale with fear. They moved in a tight cluster, glancing toward Cesare and then toward the Pope, as if searching for a way out that did not exist. Alexander VI rose slowly from his seat. He smiled the way a man smiles when unveiling a masterpiece, and with a voice almost playful, he announced that the true entertainment was about to begin. At his command, the courtesans began to undress. Silk slid off shoulders, velvet pooled at bare feet. Jewels were unclasped and dropped like tiny falling stars. Layer by layer, 50 women stripped until they stood completely naked under sacred frescoes. A palace built for prayer now stared at a scene torn from a blasphemous dream. Some cardinals turned their heads away, fingers tracing frantic crosses over trembling chests. Others stared despite themselves, caught between shock and terror, unable to look away from the Pope's decree. A few tried to rise and protest. The guards shifted forward, making it clear protest would be answered with steel. Alfonso's body went cold. He could only stare, disbelief and revulsion locking his face in place. This wasn't a tavern spectacle. This was his wedding feast, inside the Vatican, under the eyes of men who preached virtue. Beside him, Lucrezia sat rigid, tears spilling silently down her cheeks, soaking into the sleeves of her gown. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't move. It was as if her mind had already floated somewhere else to survive what her body was being forced to witness. Then came the next order. The naked courtesans were commanded to dance between the banquet tables. Servants lit towering candelabras. Flames surged high enough to throw jagged shadows up the frescoed walls. The women moved through flickering light like specters, their silhouettes sliding over painted saints and angels. The holy images watched, silent and powerless, as the Vatican dissolved into something pagan and obscene. But Alexander VI was only warming up. Baskets of chestnuts were carried into the hall and dumped across the polished marble floor. The nuts scattered and rolled between the feet of the guests, clattering like faint thunder in the sudden quiet. Alexander's grin widened. He announced the next phase of his game. The courtesans were to crawl on all fours and gather the chestnuts with their hands and mouths, like animals driven into a contest. The woman who collected the most would be rewarded with silk cloaks, gold jewelry, and treasures taken straight from the papal vault. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the women dropped to the floor. 50 naked bodies crawled across sacred marble beneath the robes of church princes. They slipped between cardinals' legs. They scrambled under nobles' chairs. Their skin brushed the hems of scarlet and gold, while the men above them stared in stiff horror. Some of the younger cardinals, drunk and overwhelmed, laughed and cheered like boys at a carnival. Others bowed their heads, caught in the brutal war between faith and fear of the Pope who controlled their lives. From an elevated platform, Alexander and Cesare watched with open delight. They laughed, they pointed, they placed bets as if this were a cheap show in a brothel, not the beating heart of Christendom. Johann Burchard, hardened by years of scandal, would later write that he struggled to describe what he saw, not because he lacked words, but because every word felt like a sin for simply existing. Alfonso sat motionless, his stomach turning, his mind refusing to accept reality. He felt the eyes of Ferrara's emissaries on him, saw their tight faces, their helpless shame. And Lucrezia looked like a ghost in her own wedding dress. She had always known her father and brother were capable of monstrous things, but she had never imagined they would turn her wedding into a ritual of damnation. Yet even now, the night had not reached its darkest point. As midnight crept close and the Vatican clocks struck 12, Alexander VI finally raised a hand. The Chestnut banquet was declared over. The courtesans huddled exhausted in corners, clutching their humiliating prizes. Wine slicked the tables. Guests sat frozen and broken, half drunk and half stunned, staring at the floor as if it might swallow them. But Alexander was sharp now, focused, intent. His voice cut through the hall so cleanly it felt like a blade. He announced that the sacred duty of marriage must be fulfilled, and then he delivered his command. Alfonso d'Este was to prove the marriage with Lucrezia not once, but 3 times, and not in private. Every witness present was to remain in place to verify the union was sealed before the Church and the world. The hall fell into a silence so deep the candles crackled loud. Even Cesare looked sharply toward his father, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the decree. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, gone in an instant. Alfonso rose slowly, his skin drained of color. He had been raised on ideals of honor and duty, but at that moment, those ideals meant nothing. Around him, Cesare's armed men stood ready, hands firm on sword hilts. Refusal wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. Alfonso turned to Lucrezia. She trembled like a bird trapped beneath a predator's shadow. Her eyes were empty. Her spirit battered past resistance. Her lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came. Under the murderous gaze of guards and the expectant stare of the Pope, Alfonso had no choice. He escorted Lucrezia toward an adjoining chamber, a room once used for receiving diplomats, now arranged as a bridal chamber. The doors were left wide open. No privacy, no mercy, no humanity. Those who had not fled were forced to remain in the outer room in full view of what was about to take place. What followed was not a union. It was the destruction of 2 human beings. Witnesses stared in stunned silence. Some whispered prayers with shaking mouths. Others cried quietly, faces turned away. Even the courtesans, victims of their own degradation, looked away in grief. And as the Pope's horrific order began to unfold step by step, a single unspoken truth filled the Vatican like smoke. Something sacred had died in that palace, and Rome would never be the same again. By the time the night sagged into its final hours, Lucrezia had slipped into a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. Her mind did what minds sometimes do when a person is trapped in something they can't survive awake. It left, not her body. Her body stayed. It moved when it was moved. It obeyed because obedience was the only thing that kept the moment from becoming worse. But her spirit seemed to retreat somewhere unreachable, drifting away from the horror unfolding around her. Alfonso was no better. He moved like a man condemned, every step heavy, every breath stolen from him by the people who had turned his wedding into a spectacle. And still, the Pope was not satisfied. Just as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows of the Borgia apartments, Pope Alexander VI issued the command for the third and final fulfillment of his decree. Cesare was present again, watching coldly, overseeing the ordeal with the same clinical detachment he used on the battlefield. His face showed no pity. If anything, there was a quiet pride in the way he stood beside his father, as if this nightmare were another victory for the family. When it was over, Cesare announced triumphantly that the marriage was now bound 3 times, sealed in the eyes of both church and law, impossible to challenge, impossible to undo. Alexander VI lifted his wine cup in satisfaction. He smiled as though the night had been nothing more than an extravagant celebration, instead of a descent into moral abyss. What remained in the room were survivors, not victors. Survivors. Cardinals who had entered the apartments draped in scarlet as servants of God now stood as unwilling witnesses to an atrocity they could never confess. Their silence, their inaction, made them accomplices. Some stared blankly at the floor. Others couldn't stop shaking. A few kept praying under their breath, not for forgiveness, but because prayer was all they had left to hold on to. When the sun finally rose over Rome, it revealed devastation. Empty wine jugs lay toppled like casualties. Chestnuts were crushed into the marble floor, smeared into brown pulp by crawling hands and shuffling feet. Courtesans curled in corners, exhausted, humiliated, clutching prizes that now looked like mockery. Guards stood like statues, eyes downcast. In the adjoining chamber, Lucrezia lay completely still, staring upward as if the ceiling were miles away. Her body was present, but her mind was somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, trembling violently, his face buried in his hands. Nothing in his life, no battlefield, no political threat, had ever shattered him like this night. He had been raised to believe power and honor could endure anything, but what had been taken from him here could not be fought, bargained for, or restored. There was no revenge big enough to reach it. Within days, Alfonso left Rome quietly. He did not ride out with a triumphal escort. He slipped away like a man escaping a burning house, returning to Ferrara with a silence he would carry for the rest of his life. Not once did he ever speak publicly of that night again. But the story could not be contained. Word of the banquet spread like a plague. Whispers in Roman streets became murmurs in Florence and Naples. Murmurs turned into dispatches carried by riders and ships. Soon, reports were landing on desks in courts throughout Europe. Ambassadors wrote in coded letters, afraid even ink could betray them. Priests spoke in veiled warnings from their pulpits. Nobles read the accounts in a kind of stunned disbelief that felt like staring into an open grave. The Venetian envoy famously wrote that what happened in the Vatican surpassed even the darkest imaginations of ancient Rome. He declared that the Pope had disgraced not only his daughter, but the entire church. The Borgias had been feared before. Now they were seen as corruption wearing a crown. In marketplaces and taverns, people lowered their voices when uttering the name Borgia, as if the family itself might hear them and strike from the shadows. Across Europe, preachers seized the tale as proof that Rome had rotted at its core. They pointed to the Banquet not as a rumor, but as a symbol, as evidence that the seat of Christ had become a theater for sin. Among those preachers was a monk who would soon plunge the church into upheaval: Martin Luther. Years later, Luther would cite the Borgia feast as a snapshot of everything poisoned within the Vatican, a story he and others used to show ordinary believers why reform was no longer optional. The Banquet became fuel for a fire already building in Europe's soul. Meanwhile, Johann Burchard, the one man who had witnessed everything from beginning to end, recorded it all in his diary. His hand trembled as he wrote. He knew what he had seen was beyond scandal. It was beyond politics. It was a sacrilege so raw that simply preserving it on paper felt dangerous. He understood that his account might vanish under Vatican secrecy, or one day stand as the most damning testimony ever written about the Church. Lucrezia Borgia never escaped the shadow of that night. She traveled to Ferrara with Alfonso and tried to craft something resembling a normal life. From the outside, she became what the world expected a duchess to be. She funded charities. She protected artists. She nurtured literature and beauty within her court. And Ferrara did come to respect her, even love her. But those who saw her privately described the same quiet ache, a lingering sorrow, a melancholy that never lifted, eyes that had gone to places no young woman should ever have to visit. She bore children with Alfonso. She played her role. She smiled when required. Yet the marriage, incurably poisoned by that wedding night, was hollow at its center. They lived side by side, but separated by a wound no human touch could mend. Lucrezia died young, at 39, giving birth to her 8th child. On her deathbed, she asked for a priest and prayed until her final breath. Her last recorded words were not of bitterness or rage. They were a plea. I am ready to be free at last. Freedom. The one thing she had been denied her entire life. Alexander VI died only months after the Banquet, with rumors whispering that poison, the tool he had used so often, had finally found its way back to him. Cesare Borgia, stripped of power after his father's death, fled Italy, chasing a destiny that no longer belonged to him. He was killed in a lonely ambush in Spain. His body was mutilated and thrown into an unmarked grave, far from the grandeur he believed was his birthright. But the night of October 30th, 1503 did not die with them. It lived on as a symbol of corruption so severe that it helped ignite the Protestant Reformation. Luther and others invoked the Borgias again and again as proof that the Vatican had decayed into something unrecognizable. And when the Counter-Reformation came, part of its mission was to scrub that stain, to restore authority by erasing the memory of families like this one. Yet truth is stubborn. Centuries later, Burchard's diary resurfaced, dragging the Chestnut Banquet back into the light. Even now, more than 500 years after that night, the feast and the triple shame stand as infamous reminders of what happens when absolute power loses every restraint. It warns us that humanity's darkest acts are often committed in places meant to be sacred. The story of Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night is not just history. It's a mirror, a warning, a reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers behind velvet curtains while everyone who could stop it stands frozen in silence. If you made it to the end of this account, write "Beau" in the comments so we know you walked with us through this entire chilling descent. And remember, the past is not dead. It watches, it warns,